How about now? Can you hear me now? Okay. How does it sound? I have my new lapel mic. Let's see how this works. Still not playing. All right. Well, we'll get into the boring reading as Coded has made clear today. You thought, what? Oh, my collar. It's a baby chinchilla. Hey, I'm trying to be professional here, except for my Red Hot Chili Pepper shirt. All right. We're going to finish off chapter 1 since work wouldn't leave me alone yesterday. Fix that real quick. They call them the dead cat mics. Oh. See, learn something new every day. All right. So we're going to finish off on chapter 1. I forgot where I was and I had to restart my computer. So I had to guess. So Coded is too stupid to understand, therefore everything is boring to him. Yeah. Well, he was on no, you're early. We just started Peace. We hadn't even started. Really, we're just talking. But he was on Shiz, Angel, and Lupe today, so he had some criticism of me, obviously. I guess my dog's going to the dog pound soon, according to him. So it's better than an ATF rate, I guess. All right. During the 19th century, some German biblical scholars developed a critical method which discerned 4 different sources in the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These were later collated into the final text of what we know as the Pentateuch during the 5th century before the current era. Hey, Mayor, this is actually something you, as a non-believer, you might enjoy. It is not religious per se. It is just a history, really, of where the beliefs came from. But hit the like and move on if you didn't want to stick around for it. But yeah, we still love you anyway. Rock on, man. This form of criticism has come in for a good deal of harsh treatment, but nobody has yet come up with a more satisfactory theory which explains why there are 2 quite different accounts of key biblical events, such as the creation and the flood, and why the Bible sometimes contradicts itself. The 2 earliest biblical authors, whose work is found in Genesis and Exodus, were probably written editorial mistakes mess me up sometimes. Were probably written during the 8th century, though some would give them an earlier date. One is known as J because he calls his god. I'm I'm going to read these as it is written. I just want y'all to know I'm just going to go ahead and read it as written. I've had some discussions, and it seems to be okay when it's read as written. His God, Yahweh, the other E, since he prefers to use the more formal divine Elohim. By the 8th century, the Israelites had divided Canaan into two separate kingdoms. J was writing in the southern kingdom of Judah, while E came from the northern kingdom of Israel. And there's maps at the beginning we can look at. We will discuss the other two sources of the Pentateuch, the Deuteronomist and the priestly accounts of the ancient history of Israel in chapter 2. Hello, Chris. We shall see in many respects both J and E shared the religious perspectives of their neighbors in the Middle East, but their accounts do not show that by the 8th century BCE, the Israelites were beginning to develop a distinct vision of their own. J, for example, starts a history with an account of the creation of the world, which, compared with the Enuma Elish, is startlingly perfunctory. Oh yeah, that's right. Angel and Mrs. Metcalf are the same person now. I forgot about that. He broke out with a hard GER today, which was interesting. At the same time, when Yahweh God made earth and heaven, there was as yet no wild bush on the earth, nor had any wild plant yet sprung up. For Yahweh God had not sent rain to the earth, nor was there any man to till the soil. However, flood was rising from the earth and watering all the surface of the soil. Yahweh God fashioned man, Adam, of the dust from the soil, Adama. Then he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and thus man became a living being. This was an entirely new departure. Instead of concentrating on the creation of the world and on the prehistoric period like his pagan contemporaries in Mesopotamia and Canaan, J is more interested in ordinary historical time. There would be no real interest in creation in Israel until the 6th century BCE. One of my faves. When the author, whom we call P, wrote his majestic account in what is now the first chapter of Genesis, J is not absolutely clear that Yahweh is the sole creator of heaven and earth. Most noticeable, however, is J's perception of a certain distinction between man and the divine. Instead of being composed of the same divine stuff as his God, man, Adam, as the pun indicates, belongs to the earth, Adama. Remember, I talked about yesterday that Adam just means pretty much human in the Hebrew. Unlike his pagan neighbors, J does not dismiss the mundane history as profane, feeble, or unsubstantial compared with the sacred primordial time of the gods. He hurries through the events of prehistory until he comes to the end of the mythical period, which includes such stories as the flood and the Tower of Babel, and arrives at the start of history of the people of Israel. This begins abruptly in chapter 12 when the man Abram, who will later be renamed Abraham, father of the multitude, is commanded by Yahweh to leave his family in Haran, in what is now eastern Turkey, and migrate to Canaan near the Mediterranean Sea. We have been told that his father, Terah, a pagan, had already migrated westward with his family from Ur. That makes sense as to where that was. Okay. Now Yahweh tells Abraham that he has a special destiny. He will become the father of a mighty nation that will one day be more numerous than the stars in the sky. And one day his descendants will possess the land of Canaan as their own. Jay's account of the call of Abraham sets the tone for the future history of this God. In the ancient Middle East, the divine manna was expressed in ritual and myth. Marduk and Baal and Anat were not expected to involve themselves in the ordinary profane lives of their worshippers. Their actions had been performed in sacred time. The God of Israel, however, made his power effective in current events in the real world. He was experienced as an imperative in the here and now. His first revelation of himself consists of a command. Abraham is to leave his people and travel to the land of Canaan. But who is Yahweh? Did Abraham worship the same God as Moses, or did he know him by a different name? This would be a matter of prime importance to us today, but the Bible seems curiously vague on the subject and gives conflicting answers to this question. Jay says that men had worshiped Yahweh ever since the time of Adam's grandson. But in the 6th century, P seems to suggest that the Israelites had never heard of Yahweh until he appeared to Moses in the burning bush. P makes Yahweh explain that he really was the same God as the God of Abraham, as though this were a rather controversial notion. He tells Moses that Abraham had called him El Shaddai and did not know the divine name of Yahweh. The discrepancy does not seem to worry either the biblical writers or their editors unduly. Jay calls his God Yahweh throughout. By the time he was writing, Yahweh was the God of Israel, and that was all that mattered. Israelite religion was pragmatic and less concerned with the kind of speculative detail that would worry us. Yet, we would not assume that either Abraham or Moses believed in their God as we do today. We are so familiar with the Bible story and the subsequent history of Israel that we intend to project our knowledge of latter Jewish religion back onto these early historical personages. Yeah, Syria, uh, really the West Bank as well. As we'll see, Canaan was right there as part of the West Bank. Adama like Battlestar Galactica. Great show. So, accordingly, we assume that the three patriarchs of Israel, Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob, were monotheists, that they believed in only one God. This does not seem to have been the case. Indeed, it is probably more accurate to call these early Hebrews pagans who shared many of the religious beliefs of their neighbors in Canaan. They would certainly have believed in the existence of such deities as Marduk, Baal, and Anat. It was Toker. It was a huge area. The Canaanites controlled a lot. They may not all have worshipped the same deity. It is possible that the God of Abraham, the fear or kinsman of Isaac, and the mighty one of Jacob were three separate gods. We can go further. It is highly likely that Abraham's God was El, the high god of Canaan. The deity introduces himself to Abraham as El Shaddai, or El of the mountain, which was one of El's traditional titles. Elsewhere, he is called El Elyon, the Most High God, or El of Bethel. The name of the Canaanite high god is preserved in such Hebrew names as Israel or Ishmael. They experienced him in ways that would not have been unfamiliar to the pagans in the Middle East. We shall see that centuries later, Israelites found the manna or holiness of Yahweh a terrifying experience. On Mount Sinai, for example, he would appear to Moses in the midst of an awe-inspiring volcanic eruption, and the Israelites had to keep their distance. In comparison, Abraham's God El is a very mild deity. He appears to Abraham as a friend and sometimes even assumes human form. This type of divine apparition, known as an epiphany, was quite common in the pagan world of antiquity. Even though, in general, the gods were not expected to intervene directly in the lives of mortal men and women, certainly privileged individuals in mythical times had encountered their gods face to face. It's the 13% that perform 87% of the magic. The Iliad is full of such epiphanies. The gods and goddesses appear to both Greeks and Trojans in dreams, when the boundary between the human and divine worlds was believed to be lowered. They could pierce the veil, if you were. At the very end of the Iliad, Priam is guided to the Greek ships by a charming young man who finally reveals himself as Hermes. When the Greeks looked back to the golden age of their heroes, they felt that they had been closely in touch with the gods, who were, after all, of the same nature as human beings. These stories of epiphanies express the holistic pagan vision, when the divine was not essentially distinct from either nature or humanity. It could be experienced without great fanfare. The world was full of gods who could be perceived unexpectedly at any time, around any corner, or in the person of a passing stranger. It seems that ordinary folk may have believed that such divine encounters were possible in their own lives. This may explain the strange story of the Acts of the Apostles when, as late as the 1st century CE, the Apostle Paul, you're supposed to move forward, and his disciple Barnabas were mistaken for Zeus and Hermes. I was a Canaanite in 2002 when Kane teamed up with The Rock and Hulk Hogan. Geez, that was 02. Golly. Making me old, Joey, making me old. By the people of Lystra in what is now Turkey. In much of the same way, when the Israelites looked back to their own golden age, they saw Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob living on familiar terms with their God. El gives them friendly advice, like any sheikh or chieftain. He guides their wanderings, tells them whom to marry, and speaks to them in dreams. Occasionally, they seem to see him in human form. Well, sometimes it's the mileage too that adds to it. Oh, 02, he was 19, I was 30. Oh, me. So, an idea that would later be anathema, golly, anathema to the Israelites. In chapter 18 of Genesis, Jay tells us that God appeared to Abraham by the oak tree of Mamre near Hebron. Abraham had looked up and noticed three strangers approaching his tent during the hottest part of the day. With typical Middle Eastern courtesy, he insisted they sit down and rest while he hurried to prepare food for them. Still a very Middle Eastern thing to do. Prepare you food and some excellent tea that makes you think you're on speed. Let's see. In the course of conversation, it transpired quite naturally that one of these men was none other than his God, whom Jay always calls Yahweh. The other two men turn out to be angels. Nobody seems particularly surprised by this revelation. By the time Jay was writing in the 8th century BCE, no Israelite would have expected to see God in this way. Most would have found it a shocking notion. Jay's contemporary, E, finds that the old stories about the patriarchs' intimacy with God unseemly. When E tells stories about Abraham's or Jacob's dealings with God, he prefers to distance the event and make the old legends less anthropomorphic. Thus, he will say that God speaks to Abraham through an angel. Jay, however, does not share this squeamishness and preserves the ancient flavor of these primitive epiphanies in his account. This is where you have to use discernment in knowing that in the Hebrew, one of these would be God, and angels are often used in place of God in the Hebrew Bible. Some scholars would say that Jacob wrestled with God and not an angel. So Jacob also experienced a number of epiphanies. How old is Hume again? Me? 52 for a little while longer. So he had decided to return to Haran to find a wife among his relatives there. Jacob must have used it. Oh, man. On the first leg of his journey, he slept at Luz near the Jordan Valley, using a stone as a pillow. That night, he dreamed of a ladder which stretched between earth and heaven. Angels were going up and down between the realms of God and man. We cannot but be reminded of Marduk's ziggurat. On its summit, suspended at, as it were, between heaven and earth, a man could meet his gods. At the top of his own ladder, Jacob dreamed that he saw El, who blessed him and repeated the promise that he had made to Abraham. Jacob's descendants would become a mighty nation, and possess the land of Canaan. He also made a promise that made a significant impression on Jacob, as we shall see. Pagan religion was often territorial. A god had jurisdiction only in a particular area, and it was always wise to worship the local deities when you were abroad. But El promised Jacob that he would protect him when he left Canaan and wandered into a strange land. I am with you. I will keep you safe wherever you go. The story of this early epiphany shows that the high god of Canaan was beginning to acquire more universal implication. So less than 40 and more than 30. When he woke up, Jacob realized he had unwittingly spent the night in a holy place where men would have conversed with their gods. Truly, Yahweh is in this place, and I never knew it, Jay makes him say. He was filled with the wonder that it often inspired pagans, that they encountered the sacred power of the divine. How awe-inspiring this place is. This is nothing less than a house of God, or Bethel. This is the gate of heaven. He had instinctively expressed himself in the religious language of his time and culture. Babylon itself, the abode of the gods, was called Gate of the Gods, Babili. Yeah, especially when you think about in relation to the ziggurat, there was a ladder at the top of Marduk's ziggurat for people to go up and encounter God. Sorry, my dog is tearing up a box if it gets noisy. Jacob decided to concentrate this holy ground in the traditional pagan manner of the country. He took the stone he had used as a pillow, upended it, and sanctified it with a libation of olive oil. Henceforth, the place would no longer be called Luz, but Bethel, the house of El. Standing stones were a common feature of Canaanite fertility cults, which we shall see flourished at Bethel until the 8th century BCE. Although later Israelites vigorously condemned this type of religion, the pagan sanctuary of Bethel was associated in early legend with Jacob and his God. Till Canaanites are real. Yeah, he was chewing on a huge piece of wood today when we were outside. Let's see. Before he left Bethel, let's see. Yeah. Jacob had decided to make the God he had encountered there his Elohim. This was a technical term signifying everything that the gods could mean for men and women. Jacob had decided that if El, or Yahweh as Jake calls him, could really look after him in Haran, he was particularly effective. He struck a bargain. In return for El's special protection, Jacob would make him his Elohim, the only God who counted. Israelite belief in God was deeply pragmatic. Abraham and Jacob both put their faith in El because he worked for them. They did not sit down and prove that he existed. El was not philosophical abstraction. In the ancient world, manna was a self-evident fact of life, and that God proved his worth if he could transmit this effectively. I guess that's why faith is so important to the Abrahamic religions, right? Um, we're having faith in God to prove himself to us instead of us uh, doing the opposite. Um, we 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 do the things that God wants us to do, but it's him proving himself to us at some future point. It's the promise. So this pragmatism would always be a factor in the history of God. People would continue to adopt a particular conception of the divine because it worked for them, not because it was scientifically or philosophically sound. Years later, Jacob returned from Haran with his wives and family. As he re entered the land of Canaan, he experienced another strange epiphany. At the ford of Jabbok, it's a very Star Warsy name, on the west bank, he met a stranger who wrestled with him all night. At daybreak, like most spiritual beings, his opponent said that he had to leave. But Jacob held on to him. He would not let him go until he had revealed his name. In the ancient world, knowing somebody's name gave you a certain power over him. And the stranger seemed reluctant to reveal this piece of information. As the strange encounter developed, Jacob became aware that his opponent's name had been none other than El himself. So, like I was talking about earlier, Jacob then made his request. I beg you, tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? And he blessed him there. Jacob named the place Peniel, El's face. Because I have seen the El face to face, he said, and I have survived. The spirit of this epiphany is closer to the spirit of the Iliad than to the latter Jewish monotheism, when such intimate contact with the divine would have seemed a blasphemous notion. Yet, though these early tales show the patriarchs encountering their God in much the same way as their pagan contemporaries, they do introduce a new category of religious experience. Throughout the Bible, Abraham is called a man of faith. Today, we tend to define faith as an intellectual assent to a creed, but as we have seen, the biblical writers did not view faith as an abstract or metaphysical belief. When they praise the faith of Abraham, they are not commending his orthodoxy, the acceptance of a correct theological opinion about God, but his trust in rather the same way as when we say that we have faith in a person or an ideal. In the Bible, Abraham is a man of faith because he trusts that God would make good his promises, even though they seem absurd. So, again, that faith, right? How could Abraham be the father of a great nation when his wife Sarah is barren? Indeed, the very idea that could have a child is so ridiculous. Sarah had passed menopause that when they hear this promise, both Sarah and Abraham burst out laughing. When against all the odds their son is finally born, they call him Isaac, a name that may mean laughter. The joke turns sour, however, when God makes an appalling demand. Abraham must sacrifice his only son to him. Human sacrifice was common in the pagan world. It was cruel, but had a logic and rationale. The first child was often believed to be the offspring of a god who had impregnated the mother in an act of droit, droit de seigneur. In begetting the child, the god's energy had been depleted. So, to replenish this and to ensure the circulation of all the available mana, the firstborn was returned to its divine parent. The case of Isaac was quite different, however. Isaac had been a gift of God, not his natural son. There was no reason for the sacrifice, no need to replenish the divine energy. Indeed, the sacrifice would make nonsense of Abraham's entire life. Whoa, whoa. Which had been based on the promise that he would be the father of a great nation. This God was already beginning to be conceived differently from most other deities in the ancient world. He did not share the human predicament. He did not require an input of energy from men and women. He was in a different league and could make whatever demands he chose. Abraham decided to trust in his God. He and Isaac set off on a 3-day journey to Mount Moriah, which would later be the site of the temple in Jerusalem. It's crazy to think of the Temple Mount being Mount Moriah. Yeah, it's a crazy concept that in the pagan world, the divine needs that blood. Um, the Jewish sacrifice of a chicken or a bull is a different thing altogether. I believe because it's for an unintentional sin. And yeah, your firstborn being given up. I mean, wow. And like Abraham, with Isaac, he had to kill his only son after makes that chicken soup magic. um, after barren years had set in. Let's see. Isaac, who knew nothing of the divine command, even had to carry the wood for his own holocaust. It was not until the very last moment when Abraham actually had the knife in his hand that God relented and told him that it had only been a test. Oh, it's only a test. Abraham had proved himself worthy of becoming the father of a mighty nation, which would be as numerous as the stars in the sky or the grains of sand on the seashore. We are sadly been whittled down to about 17 million. Let's see. The Christian story is Jesus, the Son of God, was born of a virgin, and Isaac was born with mother who went through menopause. Very interesting parallel. Yeah, I mean, there's a few of those, right? John the Baptist was kind of a miraculous thing. Um, oh, my Lord. God will provide the ram. I like it. That was a pretty good one. I think the dog has found the cat's food. Abraham had proved himself worthy of becoming the father of a mighty nation, which would be his new. Okay, I already said that. Apologies. Yet, to modern ears, this is a horrible story that depicts God as a despotic and capricious sadist. And it is not surprising that many people today who have heard this tale as children reject such a deity. The myth of the Exodus from Egypt, when God led Moses and the children of Israel to freedom, is equally offensive to modern sensibilities. The story is well known. Pharaoh was reluctant to let the people of Israel go. So, to force his hand, God sent 10 fearful plagues upon the people of Egypt. The Nile was turned to blood, and the land ravaged with locusts and frogs, and the whole country plunged into impenetrable darkness. Finally, God unleashed the most terrible plague of all. He sent the angel of death to kill the firstborn sons of all the Egyptians, while sparing the sons of the Hebrew slaves. Not surprisingly, Pharaoh decided to let the Israelites leave, but later changed his mind and pursued them with his army. He caught up with them at the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea. It's according to which translation you want to believe. Um, Many will say if it was the Sea of Reeds and the chariots were and charioteers were drowned, that's even more of a miracle than splitting the Red Sea. So, but God saved the Israelites by opening the sea and letting them cross dry shod. When the Egyptians followed in their wake, he closed the waters and drowned the Pharaoh and his army. This is a brutal, partial, and murderous God, a God of war. War. Oh my goodness. My not as cool as you, old Brenner, but my second wife's mom used to date Robin Gibb of the Bee Gees. That's the let's see. So a god of war who would be known as Yahweh Sabaoth, the God of armies. He is passionately partisan, has little compassion for anyone but his own favorites, and is simply a tribal deity. If Yahweh had remained such a savage God, the sooner he vanished, the better it would have been for everybody. The final myth of the Exodus, as it has come down to us in the Bible, is clearly not to be meant as a literal version of events. It would, however, have had a clear message for the people in the ancient Middle East, who were used to God splitting the seas in half. Yet, unlike Marduk and Baal, Yahweh was said to have divided a physical sea in the profane world of historical time. There is little attempt at realism. When the Israelites recounted the story of the Exodus, they were not as interested in historical accuracy as we would be today. Instead, they wanted to bring out the significance of the original event, whatever that may have been. Some modern scholars suggest that the Exodus story is a mythical rendering of a successful peasants' revolt against the suzerainty of Egypt and its allies in Canaan. This would have been an extremely rare occurrence at the time and would have made an indelible impression on everybody involved. Kind of like the Haitian revolt. Oh, the Bee Gees. Yeah, I love the Bee Gees still. Um, have been an extraordinary experience of the empowerment of the oppressed against the powerful and the mighty. We shall see that Yahweh did not remain cruel and violent God of the Exodus, even though the myth has been important in all three of the monotheistic religions. Surprisingly, as it might seem, the Israelites would transform him beyond recognition into a symbol of transcendence and compassion. Yet the bloody story of the Exodus would continue to inspire dangerous conceptions of the divine and vengeful theology. Dude, we shall see that during the 7th century, the Deuteronomist Arthur D would use the old myth to illustrate the fearful theology of election, which has, at different times, played a fateful role in the history of all three faiths. Like any human idea, the notion of God can be exploited and abused. The myth of a chosen people and a divine election has often inspired a narrow tribal theology. From the time of the Deuteronomists right up to the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim fundamentalism that is unhappily rife in our own day. Yeah, that's what I was talking about, Chris, is it being something you metaphorical for something else that happened. Let's see. Yeah, the Deuteronomist has also preserved an interpretation of the Exodus myth that has been equally and more positively. See what the dog's barking at. So I don't disagree with you there, Chris. Let's see. Has equally more positively effective in the history of monotheism, which speaks of a God who is on the side of the impotent and the oppressed. Deuteronomy 26, we have what may be an early interpretation of the Exodus story before it was written down. In the narratives of J and E, the Israelites are commanded to present the first fruits of the harvest to the priests of Yahweh and make this affirmation. My father was a wandering, or I always want to say Armenian, Aramaean. He went down to Egypt to find refuge there. Few in numbers, but he became a nation, great, mighty, and strong. The Egyptians ill-treated us. They gave us no peace and inflicted harsh slavery upon us. But we called on Yahweh, the God of our fathers. Yahweh heard our voice and saw our misery, our toil, and our oppression. And Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with mighty hand and outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us here to Canaan and gave us this land, a land where milk and honey flow. Here then I bring the first fruits of the produce of the soil that you, Yahweh, have given me. The God who may have inspired their first successful peasants' uprising in history is a God of revolution. In all three faiths, he has inspired an ideal of social justice, even though it has to be said of the Jews, Christians, and Muslims have often failed to live up to this ideal and have transformed him into the God of the status quo. And I'll agree with that. So in synagogue, they would teach that to be a good Jew is to be a somebody who believes in social justice, helping the poor, helping the needy, helping the homeless. Your first fruits and tithes should go to helping them um, over anything. Let's see. And just because we have success and are a small people, people want to posit this idea of some kind of evil conspiracy or whatever. But we're just people. Um, people are people. Why can't it be? Let's see. Okay. He may have been the God of other people before he became the God of Israel. In all his early appearances to Moses, Yahweh insists repeatedly at some length that he is indeed the God of Abraham, even though he had originally been called El Shaddai. This insistence may preserve the distant echoes of a very early debate about the identity of the God of Moses. It has been suggested that Yahweh was originally a warrior god, a god of volcanoes, a god worshipped in Midian, in what is now Jordan. We shall never know where the Israelites discovered Yahweh, if indeed he really was a completely new deity. Again, this would be a very important question for us today, but it was not so crucial for the biblical writers. So, I mean, you have Abraham encountering Melchizedek, the high priest, right? Um, so it came from somewhere other than just out of the blue. Now, some will say that with the pantheon of gods, you had what Yahweh and Anat, maybe Marduk, obviously Baal, um, all the whole pantheon that they they would fight and whoever ruled until there became one who ruled over them all. I mean, I don't know. Um, I'm not sure on that one. So, in pagan antiquity, gods were often merged and amalgamated, or the gods of one locality accepted as identical with the god of another people. All we can be sure of is that whatever his provenance, the events of the Exodus made Yahweh the definitive God of Israel, and that Moses was able to convince the Israelites that he really was one and the same as El, the God beloved by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Um, this take on it, I don't know, because I mean, we look at it as initially, who I love the brothers Karamazov. Um, now I forgot what I said. It's getting Dostoevsky all up in my brain. Um, man, it left my brain. Sorry about the silence. Oh, the so-called Midianite theory that Yahweh was originally the God of the people of Midian is usually discredited today. But it was in Midian that Moses had his first vision of Yahweh. It will be recalled that Moses had been forced to flee Egypt for killing an Egyptian who was ill-treating an Israelite slave. He had taken refuge in Midian, married there, and it was while he was tending his father-in-law's sheep that he had seen a strange sight, a bush that burned without being consumed. When he went closer to investigate, Yahweh had called to him by name, and Moses had cried, "Here I am, Hineni." Let me see, Hineni. I can't do it. My The response of every prophet of Israel when he encountered the God who demanded total attention and loyalty. Come no nearer, God said. Take off your shoes, for the place you stand is holy ground. I am the God of your father, he said, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At that, Moses covered his face, afraid to look at God. Despite the first of the assertions that Yahweh is indeed the God of Abraham, this is clearly a very different kind of deity from the one that who had sat and shared a meal with Abraham as his friend. He inspires terror and insists upon distance. When Moses asks his name and credentials, that's funny. Name and badge number, sir. Yahweh replies with a pun, which, as we shall see, would exercise monotheists for centuries. Instead of revealing his name directly, he answers, I am who I am. Ahea, Asher, Ahea. What did he mean? He certainly did not mean, as later philosophers would assert, that he was a self-subsistent being. Hebrew did not have such a metaphysical dimension at this stage, and it would be nearly 2,000 years before it had acquired one. I need to see your DD 214. Well, evidently, Coded needs to see mine because he thinks I've made up my military service because I'm stupid. God seems to have meant something rather more direct. Echea, Esher, Echea is a Hebrew idiom to express a deliberate vagueness. But the Bible uses a phrase like, they went where they went. It means I haven't the faintest idea where they went. So when Moses asks who he is, God replies in effect, never you mind who I am, or mind your own business. I like that. There was no there was to be no discussion of God's nature and certainly no attempt to manipulate him, as pagans sometimes often did when they recited the names of their gods. Yahweh is the unconditioned one. I like that one too. I shall be that which I shall be. He will be exactly as he chooses, and he will make no guarantees. He simply promised that he would participate in the history of his people. The myth of the Exodus would prove decisive. It was able to engender hope for the future, even in impossible circumstances. Purposeful ignoramus wanting your service records. There's something sick about that, Berman. I don't care. I mean, I've sat there and read most of it on, you know. That's why when I read mine, I'm like, interesting. I have to pull a Todd there. Let's see. There was a price to be paid for this new sense of empowerment. The old sky gods had been experienced as too remote from human concerns. The younger deities like Baal, Marduk, and the mother goddesses had come close to mankind, but Yahweh had opened the gulf between man and the divine world once again. This is graphically clear in the story of Mount Sinai. When they arrived at the mountain, the people were told to purify their garments and keep their distance. This isn't necessarily true because the distance wasn't told to be kept until God spoke, and the Israelites would say, "Oh, we can't stand his voice. It's too much for our voice. Moses, hear and speak for us." So there was that. Take no care to go up the mountain. That is true. Or touch foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain will be put to death, because the whole mountain had become holy, right? Because of in in St. Louis, the people stood back from the mountain, and Yahweh descended in a fire and cloud. Now at daybreak on the third day, there were peals of thunder on the mountain and lightning flashes, a dense cloud and the loud trumpet blast, and inside the camp all the people trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet God. Okay, so she's getting to it here. Um, and they stood at the bottom of the mountain. The mountain of Sinai was entirely wrapped in smoke, because Yahweh had descended on it in the form of fire, like smoke from the furnace. The smoke went up, and the whole mountain shook violently. So we're looking at like a volcanic eruption, right? Um, Something of that nature. Moses alone went up to the summit and received the tablets of the law, the 15 commandments. Instead of experiencing the principles of order, harmony, and justice in the very nature of things, as in the pagan vision, the law is now handed down from on high. The God of history can inspire a greater attention to the mundane world, which is the theater of his operations, but there is also potential for profound alienation from it. In the final text of Exodus, edited in the 5th century, God is said to have made a covenant with Moses on Mount Sinai, an event which is supposed to have happened around 1200. There has been a scholarly debate about this. Some critics believe that the covenant did not become important in Israel until the 7th century. But whatever its state, the idea of the covenant tells us the Israelites were not yet monotheists, since it only made sense in a polytheistic setting. The Israelites did not believe that Yahweh, God of Sinai, was the only God, but promised in their covenant that they would ignore all the other deities and worship him alone. Right, Lola? These 15, 10 commandments. It is very difficult to find a single monotheistic statement in the whole of the Pentateuch. Even the 10 commandments delivered on Mount Sinai take the existence of other gods for granted. There shall be no strange gods for you before my face. The worship of a single deity was almost unprecedented step. The Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten had attempted to worship the sun god and to ignore the other traditional deities of Egypt, but his policies were immediately reversed by his successor. To ignore a potential source of mana seemed frankly foolhardy. And the subsequent history of the Israelites shows that they were very reluctant to neglect the cult of the other gods. Yahweh has proved his expertise in war, but he was not a fertility god. When they settled in Canaan, the Israelites turned instinctively to the cult of Baal, the landlord of Canaan. I guess this was the numbers are unexplainable. Like Abraham lived for 800 years, Moses 600. I don't know. Moses only lived 120 years. And Abraham was post flood. So he wouldn't have lived after the flood. It was only the people who lived, like Japheth was around 800 years old. A lot of people think he was the high priest of the God Most High that met Abraham, actually. So when they picked up the cult of Baal, right? It seems that they were used to just picking up local gods, as it said in the previous pages. When they settled, the prophets would urge Israelites to remain true to the covenant, but the majority would continue to worship Baal, Asherah is who I was trying to think of earlier, and not in the traditional way. Indeed, the Bible tells us that while Moses was up on Mount Sinai, the rest of the people turned back to the older pagan religion of Canaan. They made a golden bull, the traditional effigy of El, and performed the ancient rites before it. The placing of this incident in stark juxtaposition to the awesome revelation on Mount Sinai may be an attempt by the final editors of the Pentateuch to indicate the bitterness of the division in Israel. Prophets like Moses preached the lofty religion of Yahweh, but most of the people wanted the older rituals with their holistic vision of unity among the gods, nature, and mankind. Yeah, something like that. He was close. He was the closest to 1,000. And then Enoch walked with God and was not. Let's see. Yeah, the Israelites promised to make Yahweh their only God after the Exodus, and the prophets would remind them of this agreement in latter years. They had promised to worship Yahweh alone as their Elohim, and in return, he had promised that they would be his special people and enjoy his uniquely efficacious protection. Yahweh had warned them that if they broke this agreement, he would destroy them mercilessly. Yet the Israelites had entered into the covenant agreement nonetheless. In the book of Joshua, we find what may be an early text of the celebration of this covenant between Israel and its God. The covenant was a formal treaty that was frequently used in Middle Eastern politics to bind two parties together. It followed a set form. The text of the agreement would begin by introducing the king, who was the more powerful partner, and would then trace the history of the relations between the two parties to the present time. Finally, it stated the terms, conditions, and penalties that would accrue if the covenant were neglected. Essential to the whole covenant idea was the demand for absolute loyalty. Let's see. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you may not be wrong. A lot of people believe that because there was a firmament and not as many rays got through, not a firmament like Todd explains, but uh, let's see. In the 14th century, covenant between the Hittite king Marsilius II and his vassal Dupi Tashid, the king made this demand: do not turn anyone else. Your fathers presented tribute in Egypt. You shall not do that. With my friend, you shall be friend. With my enemy, you shall be enemy. The Bible tells us that when the Israelites had arrived in Canaan and joined up with their kinsfolk there, all the descendants of Abraham made a covenant with Yahweh. The ceremony was conducted by Moses' successor Joshua, who represented Yahweh. The agreement follows the traditional pattern. Yahweh was introduced, his dealings with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob recalled, then the events of the Exodus were related. Finally, Joshua stipulated the terms of the agreement and demanded the formal assent of the assembled people of Israel. That's a good way to get consent through peer pressure, huh? So now fear Yahweh and serve him perfectly and sincerely. Put away the gods that you once served beyond the river Jordan and in Egypt, and serve Yahweh. But if you will not serve Yahweh, choose today whom you wish to serve, whether the gods of your ancestors served beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are now living. The people had a choice between Yahweh and the traditional gods of Canaan. They did not hesitate. There was no other God like Yahweh. No other deity had been so effective on behalf of his worshippers. His powerful intervention in their affairs had demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that Yahweh was up to the job of being their Elohim. They would worship him alone and cast away their other gods. Joshua warned them that Yahweh was exceedingly jealous. If they neglected the terms of the covenant, he would destroy them. The people stood firm. They chose Yahweh alone as their Elohim. Then cast away the alien gods from among you, Joshua cried, and give your hearts to Yahweh, the God of Israel. The Bible shows that the people were not true to the covenant. They remembered in the times of war when they needed Yahweh's skilled military protection. But when times were easy, they worshiped Baal, Anat, and Asherah. In the old way, although Yahweh's cult was fundamentally different in its historical bias, it often expressed itself in terms of the old paganism. When King Solomon built a temple for Yahweh in Jerusalem, the city that his father David had captured from the Jebusites, it was similar to the temples of the Canaanite gods. It constituted 3 square areas, which culminated in the small, cube-shaped room known as the Holy of Holies, which contained the Ark of the Covenant, the portable altar which the Israelites had with them during their years in the wilderness. Inside the temple was a huge bronze basin representing Yam, the primeval sea of Canaanite myth, and 2 40-foot freestanding pillars indicating the fertility cult of Asherah. Asherah. Dadgummit. The Israelites continued to worship Yahweh in the ancient shrines which they had inherited, and the Canaanites at Bethel, Shiloh, Hebron, Bethlehem, and Dan, where there were frequently pagan ceremonies. The temple soon became special, however, even though, as we shall see, there were some remarkably unorthodox activities there too. All right, I'm going to stop it there. We're at an hour 21. It's been a long day. My eyes are tired, and I'm sure we'll be partying across the street. I know Jeff had an overheating moment with his computer. So we will page 54, second sentence. Get out a post-it note. All right, same bat channel, same bat time tomorrow. Thank you, Chris. I mean, I'm trying to be fair in this, so thanks to the chat. I will see you all later. Be good, be well, and I'll talk to y'all soon.